The sky over the Coral Sea burned with fire and smoke, streaked with the trails of diving planes and anti-aircraft fire. Explosions ripped through the air, rocking the decks of the USS Yorktown, sending clouds of steel and flame into the sky. Sailors clung to whatever they could as the ship shuddered under the relentless bombardment. Every hit seemed final, a declaration that this mighty American carrier was done. Finished, vanquished. Above them, Japanese pilots roared in their cockpits, the adrenaline of battle coursing through their veins. Over the radios, officers' voices were triumphant, brimming with certainty. Target neutralized. The Yorktown will see no dawn. They laughed, high-fiving each other, convinced that the tide of the Pacific had decisively turned in their favor. Back on their carriers, Japanese commanders allowed themselves a rare moment of jubilation. Poring over the reports and photographs confirming what they believed, their enemy's heart had been pierced. And victory was theirs on the Yorktown. Chaos reigned. Fires raged, smoke choked the air, and the decks were slick with seawater and oil. Sailors fought desperately to contain the damage, but each explosion seemed to push them closer to defeat. The deafening roar of aircraft engines overhead, coupled with the incessant pounding of bombs, made every heartbeat feel like a lifetime. Yet, amid the terror, a stubborn pulse of defiance remained. The men worked feverishly, patching, plugging, and praying, unwilling to surrender to the inferno around them, unseen by the jubilant Japanese officers. The Yorktown's crew clung to life and to hope. Every spray of water, every daring repair, every frantic order whispered through the corridors was a silent defiance of the narrative the enemy had already written. The carrier might appear dead from the skies above, a floating ghost in the blue expanse of the Pacific, but the heart below deck still beat with relentless determination. As Japanese celebrations roared across the carriers. The audience feels the first hint of irony. The Yorktown, battered and broken in appearance, was far from finished. The apparent victory, the moment of unrestrained triumph, was a miscalculation, a dangerous assumption that would soon echo back across the ocean in ways no one could yet imagine. The scene closes on a horizon lit by smoke and fire. A ship seemingly lost but refusing to die. Somewhere in the shadows of the Pacific, the Yorktown waits, a quiet storm ready to rise again, carrying the weight of American ingenuity and stubborn courage that the Japanese fleet has yet to reckon with. The game is far from over. The morning sun barely pierced the smoke-streaked skies over Pearl Harbor. The air was thick with the acrid tang of oil, scorched metal, and salt from the harbor waters. In Dock No. 2, the USS Yorktown lay battered and bruised, a once proud Leviathan reduced to a wounded giant. She seemed like a ghost of her former self, her deck scarred with jagged holes, her flight deck torn as though a giant claw had raked across it. And yet, all around her, the heartbeat of human determination refused to falter. Men moved with a sense of urgency that bordered on desperation. Engineers, welders, mechanics, and sailors worked side by side, sweat stinging their eyes, their hands raw from burns and splinters. The clock was ticking. 72 hours, 3 days, was all they had to pull the Yorktown from the jaws of death and return her to the fight. Every minute wasted was a chance lost. Every delay a potential disaster at Midway. Below deck, Chief Petty Officer Daniels barked orders over the roar of compressors and the hiss of welding torches. "We patch that bulkhead now. Keep the pumps running, don't let her flood." His voice cut through the chaos, commanding respect, fear, and obedience all at once. Men scrambled to follow, carrying steel plates, hoses, and tools as if their lives depended on it, which, in truth, they did, on the flight deck. Seaman First Class Harris balanced on a twisted girder, sweating under the Hawaiian sun, hammering rivets into a plate that would hold the Yorktown together long enough to fight another day. Nearby, Ensign Collins juggled damaged radio equipment, improvising circuits with frayed wires, soldering under the pressure of time, knowing that communication failures could mean disaster once the ship returned to the battlefront. Every repair was a gamble, every solution improvised. But failure was not an option. The tension in the dry dock was electric. At any moment, a misstep could send sparks flying into oil-slicked pools, triggering an inferno that might finish what the Coral Sea had only begun. Yet the crew pressed on, driven by exhaustion and adrenaline in equal measure. As night fell, the ship was bathed in the flickering glow of torches, welding arcs and lanterns giving the scene the feel of a living, breathing organism fighting to heal itself. And then there were the quiet moments, brief flashes of humanity amid the chaos. Daniels paused to see a young sailor with bloodied hands gritting his teeth, refusing to leave his station. He clapped him on the shoulder. "Keep going, son. We need her. Every second counts." That single touch, that single word, rippled through the dock, a reminder that every individual effort mattered, that every man had a role in keeping this ship alive. The ingenuity of the crew was staggering. When hydraulic systems failed, they rigged manual pumps. When torn steel made the decks impassable, they cut and welded new sections in record time. Every challenge met with a new solution, every problem faced with courage born of necessity. Engineers scribbled calculations on scraps of paper, sailors carried steel plates with arms trembling from fatigue, and yet no one stopped. The Yorktown was rising from near destruction, and every hammer strike, every weld, every shouted order brought her closer to life. By the second day, it seemed impossible. The Japanese believed the carrier gone, a casualty of their triumph, and yet, in Pearl Harbor, the impossible was happening. Sweat streamed down faces lined with exhaustion. Lungs burned, backs ached, hands were torn and blistered, but the crew refused to yield. They had a mission, and the stakes were clear. If the Yorktown did not return to the fight, Midway could turn into a catastrophe for the United States. Victory hung in the balance, and this ship, battered and broken, was the keystone. As the third day began, the magnitude of what they were accomplishing sank in. The Yorktown's engines roared once more, the decks were patched, the aircraft catapults repaired, and communications restored. Against all odds, the ship had been resurrected, a testament to human determination and ingenuity. The men stood back, exhausted, bruised, and beaten, but proud. Their work would soon meet the enemy, and the Pacific would never be the same. In those final hours, as the sun rose over Pearl Harbor, the Yorktown gleamed in the morning light. She was battered, yes, but alive, defiant, and ready. And somewhere far across the ocean, the Japanese Navy, still celebrating their perceived victory at Coral Sea, would never imagine the surprise awaiting them at Midway. The stage was set, the players were ready, and the tide of war was about to shift in ways no one could yet fathom. Across the vast expanse of the Pacific, Japanese carriers sailed with unshakable confidence. Their eyes were set on Midway, their minds convinced the path was clear. The reports had come in from the Coral Sea. The photographs taken from reconnaissance planes had confirmed it. The USS Yorktown was gone. The American carrier had sunk beneath the waves, leaving a gaping hole in the Pacific Fleet and a path seemingly free of obstacles. On board, Japanese admirals leaned back in their chairs, allowing themselves a rare taste of certainty. A dangerous indulgence born from arrogance. "Prepare the fleet for Midway." "There is no opposition," one officer declared, tapping a map with deliberate authority. His subordinates nodded, confident, unquestioning. Their eyes scanned the grid of the Pacific, their calculations already assuming that the Americans had lost one of their most vital pieces. For the Japanese, the battle ahead was merely a matter of execution. Victory was not a possibility, it was an expectation, but thousands of miles away. In a dimly lit room at Pearl Harbor, a very different scene was unfolding. The air was thick with smoke from cigarettes, the hum of fans struggling against the tropical heat, and the constant scratching of pencils against paper. Here, a small group of Americans labored in silence, hunched over maps and stacks of coded messages intercepted from Japanese communications. Their task was monumental: decipher the enemy's plans, anticipate their moves, and turn intelligence into action. Every decrypted line could change the course of the war, and every mistake could be fatal. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort leaned over a table, his eyes scanning a sheet of paper filled with cryptic characters. Around him, a team of codebreakers whispered to each other, trading translations, interpretations, and deductions. If F refers to Midway, then the fleet must be moving there next, one young analyst said, pointing at the notes. Rochefort's lips pressed into a thin line. The logic was painstaking, the conclusions tentative, but the stakes could not be higher. They were trying to peer into the mind of a confident enemy, to predict what the Japanese had already assumed was set in stone. The tension in the room was suffocating. Every message intercepted carried potential. Every decoded word could mean the difference between annihilation and triumph. As night stretched into day, the team worked tirelessly, following leads, cross-referencing transmissions, and constructing a picture of Japanese strategy piece by piece. Outside, the waves of the Pacific rolled peacefully against Pearl Harbor, masking the storm of decisions, calculations, and human ingenuity that would soon collide with the arrogance of the Japanese Navy back aboard the Japanese carriers. Celebration masked a crucial vulnerability. Their planes were ready, their decks manned, and their commanders confident, but they had no idea that their intelligence was incomplete, that the Americans were preparing in secret. The Yorktown, thought destroyed, had been resurrected at Pearl Harbor. Every calculation the Japanese made about the enemy fleet now teetered on a false assumption. The Americans had turned desperation into strategy, repairing the carrier in record time and keeping their plans hidden from prying eyes. Admiral Nagamo reviewed his charts once more, believing the Americans weakened and disorganized. "They cannot hope to regroup so quickly," he muttered, conviction in his voice. On deck, pilots checked and rechecked their planes, unaware that one of their most formidable targets had already returned to the fight. The sense of certainty was intoxicating, a dangerous mix of confidence and hubris. They had assumed the Yorktown was a ghost, a ship that would no longer influence the balance of power, but they had failed to account for human ingenuity, for determination, and for the relentless drive of a crew that refused to give up. Meanwhile, American commanders coordinated their strategies in the shadows. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance and Admiral Chester Nimitz pored over maps, orders, and reconnaissance reports. Each piece of intelligence from Rochefort's team was like a small window into the enemy's mind. They studied Japanese movements, calculated probable strike points, and prepared ambush that would exploit the enemy's assumptions. Every decision carried immense weight. One misstep could spell disaster, but one correct choice could turn the tide of the Pacific War. The contrast could not have been starker. Thousands of miles apart, two worlds of thought collided: Japanese confidence versus American secrecy, arrogance versus ingenuity, assumption versus preparation. The Japanese Navy believed they controlled the narrative, that history was already written in their favor. But in reality, the Americans held the pen. The Yorktown, repaired and ready, would soon emerge as a pivotal actor in the drama neither side fully understood. As the day drew to a close, tension coiled like a spring over both fleets. Japanese officers planned strikes and rehearsed attacks, their minds certain of victory. In Pearl Harbor, American commanders watched, calculated, and prepared for the moment when the deception would end and reality would strike. The stage was set, the pieces in place, and the Yorktown waited quietly, her decks humming with engines and her crew, ready for battle. The first hint of the coming storm was invisible to the Japanese, but it was palpable to the Americans. A single ship, thought lost, would soon redefine the course of a battle, and perhaps the entire war. The enemy's confidence, their triumph at Coral Sea, would soon be shattered not by luck but by intelligence, ingenuity, and a daring refusal to surrender. The tension was unbearable, the stakes unimaginably high, and when the Yorktown returned to the Pacific, the Japanese Navy would see that what they assumed was victory was, in fact, only the calm before a storm they could not anticipate. Dawn broke over Pearl Harbor, casting long, golden beams across the water, glinting off the freshly repaired steel of the USS Yorktown. She looked almost new, her battered decks patched, her guns polished, and her aircraft lined up like soldiers at attention. The carrier's scars from the Coral Sea were still visible, but they no longer defined her. The Yorktown was alive again, a phoenix risen from fire and flood, her engines humming with a quiet, deadly promise, Crewmen and officers alike approached the ship with a mixture of reverence and urgency. They had been through exhaustion, fear, and impossible odds, yet now they felt something else: hope. Sailors climbed aboard, some limping from previous injuries, some with hands still raw from welding and repair. Every man carried with him the knowledge that the ship they were stepping onto had been brought back from the brink of oblivion by nothing more than grit, ingenuity, and an unyielding refusal to accept defeat. The flight deck was a hive of activity. Pilots inspected their planes, checking fuel lines, torpedoes, and bombs. Mechanics adjusted engines, double-checked instruments, and ensured every lever and control was battle-ready. The hum of conversation, the clatter of tools, and the rhythmic thrum of engines created a symphony of preparation. It was a dance of precision and urgency, each movement critical, each second vital. Captain Buckmaster walked the decks, his eyes scanning the crew, the aircraft, and the repaired hull. Relief was written on his face, but it was tempered by a sense of responsibility that weighed heavier than any joy. "She's ready," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. Yet in those words lay a promise: the Yorktown would fight, and she would not go quietly into history as a footnote below decks. Sailors ran final checks, hearts still pounding from the previous days of ceaseless labor. Every rivet, every bolt, every cable had been inspected, and yet tension lingered in the air. They knew that battle was coming, that the ocean beyond the harbor was a waiting arena of death and fire. The sense of anticipation was almost palpable, an electric charge that made hands shake and palms sweat. As the sun climbed higher, the Yorktown's crew stood ready, their determination radiating outward. The ship itself seemed to pulse with life, a living monument to human perseverance. She had been written off, her destruction celebrated by the enemy, yet here she was stronger, faster, and more vital than ever. Pilots climbed into cockpits, engineers adjusted hydraulics, and officers gave final orders. The carrier, once a ghost in the Japanese imagination, was now a force to be reckoned with. From the bridge, Buckmaster looked out toward the horizon, imagining the coming clash at Midway. The enemy believed victory was theirs, that one crucial American carrier had been removed from the board. They had counted wrong. The Yorktown would soon take to the skies again, launching planes that would strike fear into those who had celebrated too early. And for the men aboard, the stakes had never been higher. Every action, every decision, every moment would matter when the first bombs fell over Midway. As the Yorktown moved toward open water, engines thrumming, decks alive with readiness, the sense of purpose was nearly tangible. This was more than a ship. This was defiance made steel. Against impossible odds, she had been restored, and her presence alone would change the course of history. Somewhere across the Pacific, the Japanese Navy would soon realize that what they had believed destroyed had returned not just to fight, but to shape the outcome of a battle that would define the war. The ghost carrier was no longer a myth, no longer a rumor whispered among sailors and officers. She was real, she was alive, and she was coming for Midway. The tide of war was about to shift, and the world would soon witness the consequences of American resilience and relentless determination. The smoke over Midway hung thick and heavy, a gray shroud that marked the aftermath of chaos. The ocean, once alive with the thunder of aircraft engines and the roar of anti-aircraft fire, was now eerily calm, broken only by drifting wreckage and the occasional ripple from a sinking ship. On the decks of the Japanese carriers, silence reigned, not the calm before battle, but the stunned stillness of disbelief. Admiral Nagamo stood rigid, staring at the reports in his hands, unable to reconcile them with what he had believed. His eyes scanned the intelligence. The Americans had been stronger than anyone anticipated, and the Yorktown had survived Coral Sea. What had been dismissed as an impossible resurrection was now a brutal reality. The carrier they had assumed lost was alive, operational, and instrumental in the very battle that had just shattered their offensive. Across the Japanese command rooms, officers whispered urgently, the confidence of the past days replaced by panic and fear. Plans had been drawn on the assumption that the Yorktown was gone. Every strategy, every calculation, every expected advantage had hinged on her absence. Now that absence was a lie, and the consequences were catastrophic. Ships were lost, planes destroyed, pilots missing or dead. The veneer of control had crumbled, replaced by chaos and the bitter taste of hubris on the American side. Relief was palpable, though tempered by the cost. Rear Admiral Spruance and Admiral Nimitz leaned over maps, eyes tired, faces lined with worry. They had won, but the victory was not without sacrifice. Sailors and pilots had risked everything. Planes had gone down in flames, and men had gone missing in the vast Pacific. Yet amid the loss, there was undeniable triumph. Against the odds, the Yorktown had risen from near destruction to play a decisive role in Midway. Her planes had struck with precision, her crew had executed flawless maneuvers, and the Japanese Navy had been forced to reckon with the unexpected. The scene shifted to the Yorktown itself, her decks scarred from battle, her aircraft damaged, but her crew alive and proud. Men moved quietly, tending to the wounded, salvaging what could be saved, and preparing for the next challenge. Every face bore the marks of exhaustion, fear, and determination. They had faced death and destruction, yet they had endured. They had not only survived, they had contributed to a turning point in the war. Heroism was not just in the actions of officers or pilots. It was in the quiet moments, a sailor carrying a comrade to safety, a mechanic repairing a damaged engine under fire, a lookout refusing to abandon his post despite smoke and flames. The battle had tested every individual, every decision, and every ounce of courage. And through it all, the Yorktown had remained a symbol not just of American engineering, but of the indomitable human spirit. Back on the Japanese carriers, the realization sank deeper. The arrogance that had fueled celebrations after Coral Sea now morphed into disbelief and fear. Their meticulously planned operations had failed in part because they had underestimated their opponent. The Yorktown, once thought lost, had become a pivot upon which the Pacific War might turn. One ship, resurrected from near death, had altered the course of history. The Americans knew the victory at Midway was monumental, but they also understood it was not the end. The battle had come at a cost, and the war still raged across countless miles of ocean. Yet the emotional resonance of seeing the Yorktown survive, seeing their plans succeed against overwhelming odds, was undeniable. In every repair, every calculated strike, every act of courage, there had been a tangible proof of resilience. As the sun set over the horizon, the waters reflected a muted orange glow, a stark contrast to the dark clouds of smoke lingering above. The Yorktown, though battered, sailed steadily, a living monument to determination and hope. The Japanese officers, defeated and humiliated, would carry the bitter memory of this day, a reminder that assumptions could be fatal and that underestimating human ingenuity was a grave mistake. For the American forces, Midway was more than a victory. It was a statement that, even in the face of despair, even when the enemy believed you lost, resilience, courage, and relentless determination could turn the tide of war. The Yorktown had survived Coral Sea, had fought at Midway, and had become a symbol of what was possible when human will refused to surrender. As night fell, the Pacific stretched endlessly, its waters concealing the remnants of battle. Somewhere, beyond the horizon, the war would continue. But the story of the Yorktown stood as a testament to perseverance, sacrifice, and triumph against impossible odds. The tide had turned, and the world would never forget the carrier that should have been lost but was instead reborn to shape history. The Pacific stretched endlessly, beneath a sky brushed with the colors of dawn. Calm now, where moments before there had been fire and fury. The USS Yorktown, once presumed lost in the chaos of the Coral Sea, sailed on as a living testament to human ingenuity and sheer determination. She had been brought back from the brink of oblivion, repaired in record time at Pearl Harbor, and sent into battle once more. Her story was one of resilience, courage, and the power of people refusing to accept defeat. The sailors who had labored tirelessly in the dry dock were now etched into history. Every bolt hammered, every steel plate welded, every improvisation that kept engines running and decks intact had mattered. They had turned desperation into triumph, sweat and blood into a weapon of war. Their labor had shifted the balance of the Pacific conflict, proving that even in the darkest hours, human resolve could alter the course of history. At Midway, the Yorktown had been more than a ship. She had been a beacon of hope, a pivot upon which the outcome of battle turned. Her aircraft had struck Japanese carriers with precision, her crew had executed maneuvers that defied expectation, and her mere presence had shattered enemy assumptions. Where the Japanese believed they had achieved certainty, they instead encountered the impossible, a carrier that should not have existed. Fighting with all the power and pride of a symbol resurrected, yet the triumph was tempered with the weight of sacrifice. Men had given their lives. Aircraft had been lost. The waters of the Pacific carried the echoes of struggle. Each victory bore a cost, and the Yorktown herself would eventually succumb in later battles. Still, her legacy was not measured solely in survival, it was measured in impact. She had changed strategy, morale, and the very understanding of what could be accomplished against overwhelming odds. Historians would later point to Midway as the turning point of the Pacific War, but the story of the Yorktown added depth, nuance, and a human element often overshadowed by strategy and statistics. Here was a vessel that had been written off, celebrated as sunk by the enemy, only to rise again and shape the fate of nations. There was dramatic irony in her journey. The Japanese Navy had celebrated a victory that never truly existed, and that misjudgment became their undoing. The men aboard the Yorktown, the engineers who rebuilt her, and the planners who deployed her had all played a role in something greater than themselves. Their courage, skill, and ingenuity became intertwined with the destiny of the Pacific theater. They had proven that determination could bend reality, that the human spirit could defy expectation, and that even in war, hope could be a weapon. As the sun set, casting a golden glow across the endless blue, the Yorktown sailed onward not just as a ship, but as a symbol of resilience in the face of destruction, of innovation when it seemed all was lost, and of the unpredictable, sometimes miraculous turns that war can take. The tides of the Pacific would continue to shift, battles would rage, and lives would be lost, but the story of the Yorktown endured. It stood as a reminder: what appears lost may yet rise. What is written as defeat may become triumph. And human ingenuity and courage can leave an indelible mark on history. The carrier that should have been gone became a legend. The Americans who refused to surrender to despair changed the course of a battle and ultimately a war. And in that triumph, quiet yet profound, the legacy of the Yorktown lived on, a story of perseverance, sacrifice, and the extraordinary outcomes born from the unyielding will of men and machines united against the odds.